Hey guys, it's Chrono. Today I'll be talking about the HD58X, a drop headphone made in collaboration with Sennheiser. Now as you can see, it has an HD600 style chassis, but its visual design pays homage to the original Sennheiser HD580 Jubilee. However, I would like to specify that this is not a remake of that headphone, as this one has a custom built driver that is specific to the HD58X and is currently not used in any other Sennheiser headphone. Now, at the time of making this review, these are available on drop for $170. This price point puts it in competition with Sennheiser's HD6XX, the Beyerdynamic DT990 Pro, and the HiFiMan HE4XX. So let's check out how these stack up. I'll be putting timestamps in the description so you can skip around to whatever part you're most interested in for the review. Now, as per usual, I want to start off with power requirements, which for the HD58X there aren't really any. I mean, these come in at an impedance of 150 ohms and a sensitivity of 104 dB, but in my experience, I was able to get good volume and sound quality pretty much straight out of every device I tested. I tried my MacBook, iPad, Nintendo Switch, and of course my JDS Lab Element 2 amp. And throughout all of these, they sounded great. It's just that maybe with some of the more low power ones, there wasn't always the most volume headroom. In any case, I will say that an amp is not required for these. Okay, on to build quality and comfort. Okay, so for the build itself, these are using, of course, the very well-known by now HD600 series chassis from Sennheiser. And while these are, mostly made out of plastic, they are incredibly durable. There is nothing on this design that makes me feel particularly, concerned about their longevity. And I mean, I've used quite a few of these over the years for, extensive periods of time, and they have never shown any signs of wear, like getting loose or flimsy or creaking or whatever. So yeah, I think that the design here is great. The only concern here is the pads. These, they tend to get worn out very fast. I think that every year or so you'll have to switch out the pads. And another thing I think is important to mention about the pads is that you have to replace these with Sennheiser original pads. For whatever reason, these Sennheiser headphones, more than any other headphone, model, brand, style that I've tried, the sound really deteriorates when you use a pad that isn't the stock one. So yes, once the time comes that you have to replace these, definitely try to get Sennheiser pads. Okay, so aside from the pads, the build here is great. The comfort is also pretty good, however, the clamp force out of the box is really vicious. The HD58X will put some serious pressure on your jaw. And there is a way to alleviate this. So basically what you do is that you extend the headband all the way, and then you see this metal part here, that is the actual, the headband. So you put your thumbs at the top and you just flex it gently a little bit so that it eases up the clamp force quite a bit. And you can actually do a similar thing here at the top of the headband, which, it makes them a lot more comfortable because then you loosen up all that pressure. The only thing I can really complain about is that I feel like the pads here are not that wide in the inside, so I feel like sometimes my ears will touch the inner side of the pad, and I don't think I have particularly large ears. So if you're sensitive to that, do be aware. Still, they're pretty comfortable to wear pretty much indefinitely. I mean, these are extremely light, I think only 250 grams, and all the padding on the headband on the pads is, it's very comfortable. So they still get a pretty good rating from me. In the past, I've really enjoyed the sound of these 600 series headphones from Sennheiser, and I think, the HD58X really falls into that same kind of sound. So yes, I'm already saying that I like the way the HD58X sounds, however, it does have its flaws. So, I like the way these sound out of the box, but I'm also going to be talking about how they sound with EQ, because I feel like these actually react really well to EQ, and they get pretty close to my personal sound target. But anyways, as per usual, we'll start off by talking about the bass. So, the bass here unfortunately follows suit with the other 600 style Sennheiser headphones, in which is that the bass here is a little lacking. They start to roll off pretty aggressively at around 80 hertz, and that makes the bass come across as a little bit shallow. And then there's also an elevation at 150 hertz, which makes the bass sound, to me, a little bloated and undefined. But I mean, I still think the bass here is enjoyable, and it was actually surprising to hear that they have quite decent slam. Probably more so than the other Sennheiser headphones that are similar to these. With EQ, you can somewhat resolve the issues in the bass. The 150 hertz bump you can easily decrease, and that makes the bass sound a little bit more defined. However, you can't really make up for the lack of extension on these, because if you start to bump up the bass, or you add too much of an aggressive bass shelf, these actually start to distort pretty early, so you can't really push it that far up. Okay, so on to mids. The mids here, I've always thought there's something really special about Sennheiser's mids. Their tonality is just so good, and the timbre is just so natural sounding, and I'm really glad that that quality is present here in the HD58X. The only real issue I have with the mids here is that, unfortunately, the technical performance isn't that great. These have a fair bit of grain compared to things like the HD6XX, the 4XX, and the 990 Pro. Now, I have to say that the loss in resolution isn't really that bad. It's just that it's accentuated by a couple issues that there are in the highs, and I'll talk about that later when I get into the treble. But really, aside from that, I have no issues with the mids. These are probably some of the most natural sounding mids to me out there, and that they're pretty close to neutral, or at least what I consider to be neutral. With EQ, the only thing I changed here is that I had a very slight reduction at 3.5K, just because I find that a little forward to my taste, but even then, I don't think that's a change that most people will need or that they'll even find forward. Okay, so now on to what I consider to be the most interesting part of the HD58X's frequency response, and that is the highs. So there are two major things that stand out to me in the HD58X's highs. The first one is this very aggressive peak at 5.5K that, it adds a significant amount of glare, but also adds to this perceived loss of resolution effect. It's very similar to what I mentioned about the 6K peak on the LCD2s. However, I think that the degree to which this affects the HD58X's perceived resolution is a lot higher than that on the LCD2. Once you reduce that peak, the mid-range cleans up quite a bit, and the gap narrows in resolution between the HD58X and the 6XX and the 990 Pro and the other headphones that I've mentioned so far. Now, the second thing that stood out to me is that beyond 8K, there really isn't any trouble at all. I mean, a lot of instruments' overtones lie in that region above 8K, and not having them there made the headphone sound a little congested, and it's made some instruments, particularly cymbals, sound very unnatural. So yeah, overall I would say that the highs here sound very muted after 8K. However, the extent to which this affected sound quality, I feel like it really depended on the genre, because I don't feel like I was missing that treble extension in genres like rock, hip-hop, pop, more modern things. But if I was listening to jazz or classical, the highs didn't really cut it here. But then again, I have to mention that once I added EQ to that region above 8K, I could really bring up the highs back to target, which not only made the headphones sound more natural to me, but I think it also made them more suitable for a wider variety of genres. Lastly, I'd like to say that I actually think I found these to be more resolving in the highs than the DT990 Pro, at least after EQ. However, they still lag behind the HD6XX in treble resolution and treble extension. Okay, so moving on from frequency response onto soundstage and imaging, which unfortunately is not one of the HD58X's strong suits. The soundstage here is extremely narrow, and it really pales in comparison when put up against, the 990 Pro, the K7XX, the HE4XX, and even some closed-back headphones like the DT770 Pro. The imaging as well is not really that great. I mean, there is a very good center, left, and right image. However, front left and front right seems to have a bit of a gap there. Now, I know that the HD58X gets recommended a lot for gaming, but I highly advise against it. For gaming, there are significantly better options out there at the same or even lower price point. One positive thing that I can say about the imaging, however, is that the instrument separation is very good. It's definitely better than the DT990, I think on par with the HD6XX, and maybe a little bit behind the HE4XX. Also, just to clarify for those who are wondering, what I mean by instrument separation is that I'm referring to how easy it is to distinguish the different components that make up complex musical passages. And I really think that this is something that the HD58X does better than a lot of other headphones in the similar price bracket. Now, dynamics here are actually very good. I don't often associate, good punch and slam quality with Sennheiser at least 600 series headphones. And I can also say that the micro dynamics are pretty good here as well. They definitely do a very decent job at recreating the weight behind instruments. I think they do it better than the 6XX, but not as much as the DT990 Pro. Lastly, I'd like to discuss EQ a little bit, even though I've been talking about it extensively in this review. When EQ is applied to the 58X, I think in general it cleans up the bass and it just makes the headphone sound a little clearer, especially because of that reduction at 5.5K. If you are interested in trying out my EQ, as per usual, I will leave it in the description down below and you can, input it into whatever EQ software you like to use. But anyways, to wrap up on my review of the HD58X, I'm actually going to say that this is my personal pick for music listening under $200. I really think that the 58X has a winning combination here. I mean, it has fantastic durability and longevity. It is very easy to drive and doesn't require an amplifier. And the sound that these have out of the box is actually very enjoyable. As I mentioned earlier, for genres like rock, hip hop, modern music, which is actually the stuff that I listen to the most, these are actually very good. The only time that I didn't particularly enjoy these was with music where the treble was particularly important, jazz, classical, the same things I mentioned earlier. But yeah, I think that at $170, these are an amazing package overall, and it only gets better with EQ. Now, I know that some of you may wonder why I chose the HD58X over the similarly priced HD6XX, and my reasoning for this is that the HD6XX, although it's very close in price to the 58X and to that $200 price tag, it requires an amplifier to actually sound good to reach its full potential, which makes them significantly more costly. Whereas the 58X can basically be driven by anything. Anyways, that is all for me today. I hope you guys enjoyed the video or found it helpful. If you did, do consider dropping a like or even subscribing to the channel for future content. Until next time, this is Chrono signing off.